Sharing your family stories. So this is a picture of my great aunt Tot. Her name was Ella May. She was called fondly Aunt Tot. And she is the second lady on the right. And this is a picture taken of her and her Hollister school friends who were school teachers. She was a school teacher in Hollister. And she played a major role in my life because she, every Christmas and every birthday, she gave me the perfect age-appropriate gift of a book. And I think maybe she's one reason why I became a librarian. And I have saved all those books. So she was definitely a role model for me. And her story is important. And it's my responsibility to save that story and pass it on to my kids and my descendants. So with that, let's just jump in and do it. My son, I was whining about the fact that I had so many stories to tell and I didn't know what to do about it. And he said, Mom, just jump in and do it. Just stop whining and do it. So a few years ago, I decided I better do it. If my son said I better do it, I better do it. And getting back to that picture I showed you at the beginning of our class, all great stories lead back to us. Well, they do. It's not just the stories of our ancestors, it's our story and how our story is connected to our ancestors. So today we're going to talk about those stories of our ancestors and our own stories. This is a picture taken on the right with myself and my daughter and my mother. And my daughter knows my story pretty much, and she knows a lot of her grandmother's stories, but she doesn't know her great-grandparents' story. And the picture on the left is me with my mother and my grandparents. And I know my grandmother's story. My grandfather passed away shortly after I was born, but I don't know my great-grandparents' stories. And Sarah, my daughter, doesn't know her grandmother's stories. So we lose them after 3 generations. And if, we want to pass them on, it's really our responsibility to save those stories. So today I'm going to share a couple of my family stories and I hope inspire you to put down your stories. And I'm going to share ways you can pass on your stories. It doesn't have to be in a written format. It can be in another way. So I'm going to share that with you. And this is a picture of, this is the great uncle who was looking for a bride, the Swedish great uncle. And he finally found his bride, Ellen. All stories are important, and they're the stories about where we're from, where we've been, what have we overcome, what trials have we faced. They say that the kids whose families shared family stories of successes and disappointments and trials fare better later in life because they know that their family has survived them and they've learned some tools about how they too can handle those crises. So we want to share those stories so that we give our descendants tools to deal with their lives. Some of the things we might want to write about are why we made the decisions that we did, and do we have special gifts or special interests? And what about our occupations? That's important too. And then we have relationships with family, friends, neighbors, and business associates. And those are all stories in themselves. So this is that cascading pedigree chart we talked about. And what I view this like a hanger on which we put our clothes, we put the texture and the color of our stories on this hanger. We have the birth, we have the marriage, we have the death date, we have locations, but there's a way of fleshing it out and making it more a story. So this is what we start with. It's like our outline. And then this is a fan chart we talked about that has all the options, all the stories we can choose from. And this is my mother's fan chart. I have one just like that from my dad. So all of those stories are in addition to my dad's stories. So where do we start? Well, what I recommend is you start with a story that interests you. And you build on perhaps a story that's been passed on down to you, something you've heard somewhere along the line. And then you begin with a story that you've researched. And you throw in some photos, and maybe there's some family heirlooms you have that you want to talk about. So just start with something that grabs you right now. This is my great-great-grandfather, John Willis Green. And he was an amazing man. He was from Michigan, and he came out to California during the gold rush. And he arrived in 1850, right in the midst of the gold rush. Now, this is not a picture of him. This is a picture I took from the internet, from one of the digital collections. And we can do that with our stories. We don't just have to have our own family pictures. We can incorporate other pictures. We'll talk a little bit more about that later in the class, but we can incorporate those pictures as well. And these men are by a sluice where the water was projected down that kind of wooden building, and the gold was caught at these different places where it stopped, and then they could take it out and then they would pan for gold. So this just gives me some insights into the gold rush, and this is not a personal picture that I had. Here's another picture of perhaps gold miners where they were staying in a log cabin, and again the sluice box that they're using. So these pictures sort of bring the story more to life. And then, of course, I do have some family pictures, and you've seen this one. This is Daniel Monroe and Emma Sarah. And the story that goes is that John Willis Green, Emma Sarah was his daughter. She was about 18. John Monroe was in his 20s, and he just graduated from Daniel Monroe, he had just graduated from law school in Albany. He was one of his fellow classmates was William McKinley, which he was very proud of. And he came back to Michigan to marry his bride. And he told his father-in-law, John Willis Green, that they were moving out to California and that he was establishing a law firm in San Francisco. And John Willis Green, who had had this very good experience in California, mining for gold, said, well, he was in his 40s now. He said, well, I think we'll go with you. And he up and sold his property and his brick manufacturing company that he had. And he talked another daughter and her husband, who was a Union veteran from the Civil War, and his two teenage daughters, and the 8 of them went off to California in 1868. You can see that Emma Sarah may be pregnant. I don't know if this was taken in San Francisco or before they left, but I know she was pregnant on the trip. They went down to the isthmus and crossed the Panama Isthmus. They at that time, the railroad wasn't built, and that's the kinds of things we can research. It wasn't until 1869 that the Transcontinental Railroad was built. And the only option they had was to come around the Horn, was to go down to Panama, or to come across in a covered wagon. And they chose to go down and cross Panama. Well, the story that my mother told me was that she crossed the isthmus on a mule, and she was pregnant. Well, when I did some research, I found out that there actually was a mule train that had been built. It was called a mule train, small gauge railroad, that crossed the isthmus, and she was on that. And they came across, and then they took a steamboat ship up to San Francisco in 1868, the 8 of them. This was another story that my family told me. My mother said this was her trunk that she brought with her when she came down on the steamship and crossed Panama. I did some research into this trunk, and I found out that this style was patented in the 1880s. So it did not accompany her in 1868, but it was her trunk, and it still is 140 some odd years old. So it is still of special interest to me, but it was not the trunk that came with her. They came to San Francisco in 1868, and it was thriving, the gold rush town. The ships that had been left and stranded were used to fill in the marina area, and it was a good place for a lawyer to come. There were lots of things going on, agricultural law and corporate law. Broadway was busy. This is 1860. And so I wanted to confirm where they were living and where this law firm was. And I saw that Daniel Monroe on the left-hand side was living on Washington, on 606 Washington. And I saw that his law firm was on Sacramento, 636 Sacramento. Now these are directories. And again, a lot of these are online, but a lot are not. So in some cases, you may need to contact the public library where your ancestors lived. So I was curious how close he lived. This is all about being curious. It's like asking yourself questions and saying, I wonder, or I'm going to check this out. So I saw that he and Emma were living at 606 Washington Street, and his office was at 636 Sacramento. So I wondered if maybe he walked to work. It was 4 blocks. This is what Montgomery Street looked like in the 1860s. So he would have walked down probably Montgomery to Sacramento, or he would have come around on Kearny. And that just gave me a little idea of what his life must be like, what San Francisco was like when he was there. Meanwhile, his father-in-law, John Willis Green, has come to Hollister. And because he did okay with the gold rush, he has invested in land in Hollister. And a lot of my information now, because he's so removed from me, he's a great-great-grandfather. This is information that I've had to search for because I really haven't heard the personal stories. But there are these things called mug books. And the mug books are biographical sketches, kind of the who's who of the 19th century, where a prominent person in a community would pay to have a biographical sketch written about him. And they're all over the country. Often they were done for 100-year celebrations of a town, or a town was up and coming and they wanted to talk about their prominent citizens. Well, in this particular book, there was a section written about John Willis Green, which he probably wrote and maybe was interviewed for and probably paid to have it in there. And that's given me a lot of information. This was actually a picture in that book of his farm that he purchased outside of Hollister, about 3 miles outside of Hollister. It was part of the San Justo Rancho, and it was divided up by Hollister. He bought part of that land, and then he divided it up and sold those lots. So in that book, I saw that the books gave me a lot of information. It said that John Willis Green is a pioneer of the state, having crossed the mountains in 1850. He endured many hardships on the journey, walking the entire distance from Joliet, Illinois to Sacramento in 5 months. His search for gold was not successful, and he returned east the following years. But not satisfied with the change, he returned, and in the winter of 1852 and 53, mined in Nevada City for 13 months and made $6,500, with which he returned to Michigan. And this was in that book, plus much more about his silo and his ranch, etc. Okay, let's see. So Daniel and Emma are in San Francisco until 1871. Meanwhile, her father and her family are all in Hollister. And I don't know exactly what happened, if in fact Daniel was just tired. I know they lost a baby while they were in San Francisco. I do know her sister in Hollister also lost a baby. And they decided to move down to Monterey County. Hollister was part of that at that time. San Benito County was divided from Monterey in 1874. And Daniel Monroe raises sheep. And I found in a directory on the Peachtree area that he was a fine sheep raiser. And he was associated with 2 people that are pretty famous in Monterey history, Jesse D. Carr and David Jacks, controversial in that they were land developers. And I don't know if he did legal work for them or raised sheep for them, but he was associated with them. And then in 1877, I found that he was a county supervisor. And I could explore that more by going into the county supervisor's minutes and see what kinds of issues they were discussing at that time. And then in 1885, he became foreman of the Peachtree Ranch owned by Miller and Lux. And that's a whole nother thing to research. Miller and Lux were German butchers who came in during the gold rush and became very wealthy, selling meat to all of the miners. And they owned thousands of land out of Los Banos up north and into Monterey. And my great-grandfather was the manager of 3,000 acres of one of their big ranches. Well, in 1891, by that time, Lux had died, and there were some questions about with the descendants, just some squabbles over the division of the land, and there were water issues. And that's nothing new for our county, but that was certainly a case in 1890s. And looks like Daniel and Emma decided to leave. I don't know if it was due to what was going on with that ranch, but they left and went up to Washington and were there for a year. It wasn't very successful. They came back to Castroville and then to Hollister again, where the family was, and then finally to San Francisco. So I tracked all this through the census, through directories, through documents that I found, because I didn't know about Daniel and Emma. I just had heard stories here and there, but nothing really concrete. So it was a matter of trying to figure out what documents were available. I did have a lot of pictures, and my parents were kind enough to identify them. This was the Peachtree Ranch. I don't know if this is the house where they lived or not, but this was buildings on the land. And these were some of the farm workers on that ranch, or the ranchers, I should say. And here's the harvest. It was a thrashing machine. They're probably getting the wheat. And this picture is of my grandfather on the left and his older brother, Jim, on the right. They were raised on that ranch. I don't know about that house, if that was part of where they lived or where the ranch workers lived. But if my parents hadn't labeled these pictures, I wouldn't have known who these people are. So I'm really grateful for that. When they came back to Castroville, they rented this gorgeous house. I don't know what it looked like then. It was the part of the Castro family. Whoever owns it today has just done a beautiful job. It's on Merritt Street, right in downtown Castroville. And they came back with their big family and they lived there for a while. And my grandfather probably took the train into Monterey because he went to the school when Colton Hall was a school. And that's the jail next to it. This is from the clipping file in the Monterey Public Library. These kinds of pictures are there that if you have Monterey ancestors, you can certainly use them for your stories. And this is a postcard of downtown Hollister, where my great-great-grandfather continued to live with his family. And Aunt Tot, LMA, who I started my story with, was a school teacher in Hollister, and here she is on the steps of her school. She's on the right there. The picture above, I know she taught school in Tres Pinos as well, and I don't know what this building is, and I'm wondering if this was a schoolhouse out there, because my parents didn't identify that one, but there she is with her class. When I was in the California State Library, I was able to see the list of teachers teaching in San Benito County and the number of students they had and the racial and ethnic breakdown of the students. And there she was with her class in the California State Library records. That was pretty exciting. So then this family moved to San Francisco. The kids grew up and they got jobs in San Francisco, and they had a house on Lincoln Way out by the Panhandle in 1902. And it was a duplex, and they lived together. Two of the daughters weren't married, and they all lived together. And another couple who did, a son who got married, lived down the street. And then we know what happened in 1906. And this is from the Library of Congress, another place to get pictures for your story. the fire and the earthquake. And this is a stereoscope. Maybe you've seen some of those. It's like the 3D viewers we used, Master Viewer, what we used to have when we were kids. You put it in, it's it almost is 3D as you look at it through this magnifying glass. This is a picture I got from a book of the eating out in the streets, and this is what my family did. Although they did not lose their house that they rented, they were out on the streets cooking because the gas was turned off. And I do have a letter that Daniel Monroe wrote to his family in Hollister, April 24th. The quake was terrible, but the fire was even worse. It is too dirty cooking out in the street on a campfire. You know we have no gas yet, but last night we could have lighted a candle until 10 p.m. The quake broke all of Daisy's pretty dishes except those she had on the table. That would be his daughter-in-law. Our mantle was twisted off, fell against the table, broke a vase of flowers. So they were very lucky in that they were not in the downtown area that had the fire, but they were still impacted by the earthquake. And there they are, and later in life, in the backyard of their San Francisco home, Daniel and Emma Monroe. So, you know, I really have a story there to write up. And even if I just do it in pictures with one-liners underneath, I'm still passing on their story. And I was able to put this together because I did go to the Big Four and won, and those are the ones we talked about: Ancestry, Family Search, Find My Past, My Heritage, Heritage Quest. And I did go to Google and I found things there. And as I got curious about different things that were happening, the historical context of their lives, I would look for some of these things in newspaper articles and in periodicals to try and put that story together. So specifically, and I want to show you how I found these different things, because I hope that you will do this too. I went online, or I went to libraries or historical societies, and I was looking for the census, because that tracks the movement of a family. I was looking for directories, which also does that, and the voter registration does that. And I was looking for newspapers and periodicals. Obituaries are amazing because they show you relationships, the people, the survivors, the people who are still alive. Maps show you where people lived. Biographies, memoirs, and historical fiction. It doesn't have to be about your person, but if it's about somebody who lived in that place at that time, that gives you ideas about what was happening when they were there. And then local histories, which were published quite frequently in the 1900s, and the biographical sketches, the mug book that I showed you about my great-great-grandfather. And then there's all the secondary sources, and then there's the photos. So those are the kinds of things that you want to pull in to put your story together. So this was a find for me. I just was so excited to find this one. And I found this online. Although often voter registration is not always digitized, you may need to go to a library in the area. But this is San Francisco, 1911 voter registration. And in 1912, women were given the opportunity to vote in California. California was ahead of the rest of the country. And so this voter registration shows that my great aunts were indeed registered to vote. Voter registration will often show you the occupation and the residence, two really great sources of information. So this is a source that you want to pursue. But this is what I found. This is 1911, getting ready for the 1912 election. And in that election, there were people running. Was Taft. He was a Republican, and he was running for re-election. Woodrow as a Republican. Woodrow Wilson was running as a Democrat. Teddy Roosevelt had created a third party, the Bull Moose Party, was a progressive party, and he was running, which split the Republican votes as a result. And then Eugene Debs, who was a socialist, was also running. So this is the way this family registered to vote. I don't know how they voted, but this is how they were registered. At the top, William Manley. He was a son-in-law. He was involved, he was an elevator builder. And of course, he was doing okay because this was after the earthquake and there was a lot of building going on. And he registered as a socialist. So he probably was a union man. So he was supporting Eugene Debs. And he lived at 1041 Lincoln Way with his father-in-law. There was a duplex. So he probably was in the apartment next to his father-in-law. Going down a little bit further is Daisy Monroe. She's the one who had her vase broken and dishes broken. She was a daughter-in-law. She was married to a banker who worked in downtown San Francisco. She was down the street at 1039 Lincoln Way, so it was another building, and she registered as a Democrat. And then Ella Mae Monroe, who was my school teacher, great aunt, registered as a Democrat. Annie Pearl Manley was married to the man who worked with elevators, and she registered as a socialist. Harriet Monroe, another spinster aunt who lived with her father and mother, was a tailoress. She worked for City of Paris. You may remember that, City of Paris, which did burn it down during the earthquake and was rebuilt. And she registered as a progressive with the Bull Moose Party. So she was intending at that time to vote for Theodore Roosevelt. And Daniel Monroe, who was retired and living at that address, the Patriot, voted, or at least registered to vote as a Republican. And Emma didn't even register. She's not even on the list. So I guess voting was just not what she wanted to do at that time. So I chuckle about this and I think about them all sitting down to dinner and what kind of a dinner conversation they might have had. Probably like some of our conversations in the last year. So that was just a find to see where they all had different ideas about who they were going to vote for. So voter registration, a key. Newspapers and magazines, another key. And I talked a little bit about how Monterey has the historic Monterey newspapers on microfilm that have been digitized and that you can access through your computer. It has newspapers from 1846 to 1964. And these are all, of course, the Monterey County Herald has changed its name over time. And these are all the different newspapers since that time. You're able to search. And if I put Daniel Monroe in, again, remember the quotes, that helps. They're not looking for all the Daniels and all the Monroes. We're just looking for Daniel Monroe. I did find a couple of things in which he was mentioned, and that was helpful to me to put this story together. One of them was names the following witnesses to prove this person, Frank Hopkins' residence. What this showed me, though, is that in 1888, he was living near San Lucas. He was on the Peachtree Ranch. It put him in time again, put him in place. So it confirmed that I knew he was still there. And the second one was of his death. Mrs. H.A. Reynolds, who was one of his daughters, left for San Francisco on their, actually, she was the sister of his wife, left for San Francisco on the early train yesterday to attend the funeral of her brother-in-law, Daniel Monroe, who was stricken with a severe stroke of paralysis over a year ago and passed away yesterday. Well, a couple of things this tells me. That tells me I didn't know that he had been ill in that way. Gives me the date of his death or the funeral, and how reminded me how people took that train to San Francisco. It was a main source of getting back and forth. And often in the newspapers, you'll see, took the train to San Francisco to visit family, something that we don't have now. You can go up to Gilroy and take it, but not all the way to Monterey or to Hollister. Now, this story is another one that added color to my story. And this goes back to John Willis Green, my great-great-grandfather in Hollister. You'll see on the right, the headline is Death in a Power Explosion. My mother had told me that there had been an explosion in San Francisco, and as a result, my grandfather made contact with the Amsler family. And she didn't know what kind of an explosion it was. She didn't know anything more than that. So I was hunting around for this and I saw that it was a powder factory. And apparently a light had broken, landed on the powder, and there had been a major fire and an explosion. And in this article, Nora Murphy was caught in some of the falling timbers, as was also Mary Amesler. The second explosion released the latter, and she hastened to the assistance of her friend. With a bravery that is remarkable, she tugged at the half-senseless, this is on the front page now, I love the writing style, at the half-senseless girl while the flames poured out, singeing her hair and burning her hands. She finally got Nora away from the wreck, but she was not yet out of danger. Her companion was so weak that she fell 3 times, and with a strength born of her love for her shopmate, the heroic 18-year-old girl half carried and half dragged her friend away from the danger. It was only after she attended to her friend that she thought of herself. She was assisted to her home in Ocean View, and a physician who had been summoned bandaged her arms and dressed the burns. Well, because of that article, several things happened. Mary Amesler suffers a dislocation of her right elbow, a burned hand, and singed hair. John Willis Green, my great-great-grandfather, he's now a widower, writes to Mary complimenting her on her bravery. He just saw the article in the newspaper, wrote her. April 6, 1898, John Willis Green marries Mary's mother, Grace Amesler. Grace's 2 children, Mary 18 and Frank 13. I did know that about this marriage, but I didn't know quite how this all came about. John Willis Green is 74 years old, 18 years older than Grace. He dies January 1st, 1905 at the age of 80. And his will is probated. This story was talked about for a long time by my mother, but she didn't know all the details. And I guess Grace did get some of the land, the Hollister land, the rest of the land, and the house. The rest of the land was left to the other daughters. So that was really a find, and I wished I could have shared that with my mother, but my mother had passed on by the time I discovered that. So newspapers are definitely a way to flesh out your story. And then books, diaries, this particular one, the Shirley Letters, written by a woman living in Nevada City at the time my great-great-grandfather visited during the mining. So he, tells a little bit about what was happening in Nevada City and what it was like. And that really has given me some color to my story. And then, of course, secondary sources, Saving San Francisco after the 1906 disaster, some great pictures in that book. These were 2 other books that gave me some color to my stories. I remembered as a child, reading to my children, my daughter, The Long Winter by Laura Ingalls Wilder. At that time, Laura Ingalls Wilder was in North Dakota, 1880, exactly when my family was there. And I went back as an adult and reread that and realized the description that she gives of her childhood and the terrible snowstorm that took place in the year of 1880, the fact that trains couldn't come in, they couldn't get food, they couldn't, just going out to the barn to feed their animals, that having a rope from the house to the barn, eating leather, putting it into kind of a stew. It made me think of what a horrendous first year my family must have had in the North Dakota area. And then this other book was again a diary of the time when my family was in North Dakota. So these are the kinds of things that can help you develop an idea about what the life was like of your ancestors, even if you didn't know them. And photos, of course, add to the story. They help us develop the setting, and they lend insights into the people and the dress and the food and the houses and the professions and the military connections. And they don't have to just be photos that you have in the family. They can be photos of that location at that time. So they show us where a community lived, where a family lived, and what the community was like, what the houses may have been like, the occupations, the tools, and the military dress. So this is one of my very favorite pictures of my Swedish great-grandfather in North Dakota. And I love this because he's with a butter churn. He's got his Levi Strauss jeans on, which of course were made very popular during the gold rush. Notice how they're ripped, in his worn boots, his shirt. He has a wedding ring, his Swedish cap, which he wore on lots of his pictures. And I don't know if this is the house in North Dakota or a shed which was on there, 160 acres, but his work clothes hung on pegs outside the door. He's only in his 40s in this picture. He was 40 when he came to America, and he was only in North Dakota for 10 years. So he's really had a hard life already. But I just think this picture captures so much of the person that he was. So where do we find these pictures if we don't have them in our own family? And of course, we don't have the pictures for those before 1839, because that's when photography first came into being. So we need to go other places. So we can go to Google. Library of Congress has amazing pictures. California State Library Gallery, Flickr, the Internet Archive, and Wikipedia. These are all places we can go for photos. But we need to check the copyright status. If you're doing a book or you're doing something for family, you don't have to be so particular about it. But if you're doing it for commercial status, you definitely do. And if you're sending it off to libraries, you probably should check this. I wasn't so good about this on this first book that I put together, but I figured that because of public domain, they're all pictures that were before 1925. I feel like I probably am going to be okay. But that is something to consider if you are extending, getting your story out beyond your family. The public domain images usually allow usage. So if it's before 1925, you can feel pretty safe about that. And there's a Creative Commons license, which gives specific rights to image users. And then we'll talk a little bit about that. These are just things to consider when you are taking pictures off the internet or taking them from a library or another repository. Generally, you need to, if you are taking it from the library, you just need to make arrangements with them. It's not a problem, but you need to get permission from them. So this is how it works with Google. You go into Google Images, and if you go into the settings and you go into advanced search, there on the right, you'll see that there is a Creative Commons license, usage rights. And if there is a Creative Commons license for a particular picture, now then you do your search and you'll only get pictures with Creative Commons licenses. If there is a Creative Commons license, you can share, use, and build upon a work that the author has created. You can use that picture. You can do anything you want with it because they have given you permission to do that. So if you're looking for images, you might try that. Go to advanced search, click on that, click on Creative Commons, and that will give you pictures that you can feel free to use. Make a note of where you got that picture. And you can do that in the metadata, or you can make a note somewhere, but just so you don't forget. This is from Google also. I went into Kingsburg. I wanted this train station because this is the train station they would have come into when they came from North Dakota into Kingsburg. And I got this through Creative Commons. This is from Flickr, same thing. This is a sod house in the Dakotas. I wanted to, they would have had to build a sod house when they first came, because if you were given land, 160 acres with the Homestead Act, you needed to build a house on it of some kind, and they didn't have trees. So sod houses were very popular. So I used Flickr for this one. And I went in again to advanced settings, all Creative Commons. This is a ship. I used Wikipedia for this. Wikimedia Commons is connected to is what the Wikipedia one is. And this I also was able to get a Creative Commons license, so I could use that picture. So I'm just saying, just be conscious of that if you are going to do something commercially with your story. The public domain, under the copyright law, anything published before 1925 is really free to use. It can be a film, it can be a book. In fact, just this last year, The Great Gatsby by Fitzgerald and Aerosmith by Sinclair Lewis have gone into the public domain, which means they can be used. They can be published, anything can happen to them. Also, unpublished works whose authors died in 1950 and before have entered the public domain. So that gives you some freedom to use some of these things in your story. And if you want to pursue this, Cornell University has a really good web page that goes into copyright law. YouTube's a little bit more problematic because there's creativity in putting old photos together. So you may find the perfect thing on YouTube, but you probably need to write them to get permission because they've used those pictures and incorporated in a creative story, and they may have the copyright to that. So that's something to be aware of with YouTube. Okay, so it's time to jump in. You got your chart. You have some family photos, maybe. You've researched an ancestor, or maybe you have a story about yourself that you want to pursue. And now is the time to share that story and present it in some format that might appeal to your family. So we all have excuses, just as I did with my son. I'm not a writer. I don't really know what to do. It's too hard. I don't have enough information. I need to, I need to research some more, but we all know that that's we're always never going to have enough information, and we're always going to need to research some more. So we have to stop at some point. We can always add it in later. And I don't know where to begin. So those are all the excuses we have. So, well, maybe a book and writing is not your thing. So what about some other options? Well, maybe you just need to just do a family tree and have it printed and put in a frame and give that to your family. And that's a gift for them to see where they came from and who they are. So that's a place to start. But maybe you might want to do a book. I know that for myself, I'm not going to be doing the book from 1620 to 2021. I'm not going to be starting at the beginning and going all the way forward. That's just way more than I want to tackle. There are registered books that do that, and people have put together all their lineage, but that's not for me. So the book that I have done are a little different, and I'll share that with you. Maybe you're really really a techie and you want to do a blog or a website, and that's a possibility too. And that will require a few different skills. Maybe just a scrapbook. Maybe that's all you need to do, or just put the photos together and be sure and label them. Maybe just interview yourself or a family member. Get an interview out there and transcribe it, or send it out on flash drive to your family. Maybe there's a journal or diary that is in your family. Maybe you're a poet. Maybe you want to write a poem. A shadow box, a collage, a quilt, maybe embroidery. Wherever your talents are, wherever your interests are, follow those to share the story. And then last, maybe there's a slideshow or a movie that you want to share. So where do you begin? Okay, select your ancestor. Choose an ancestor you're drawn to. Choose one you researched. And choose one about whom maybe you have heard a few personal memories or some stories. And begin with one sentence. Okay, my Hollister great-great-grandfather. He was born in 1824 in Augusta, New York. Well, I can look what was happening in America in 1824, and I can find out what was happening in Augusta or Oneida County in 1824. And I can go and check the newspapers, add a few details from that, and maybe I can explore why his father was there. Well, as it turns out, his father fought in the War of 1812 and was given land, a bounty land, when he left the military. And so they went up to New York and settled into New York from New Jersey. So that's a story. That's another part of the story. Check the census. See what the occupation of his father was. Did they live on the farm? What about his siblings? Does he have a big family? What happened to all of them? That's part of the story. And then did the family stay in Augusta or did they move? And why might they have moved? Well, they did move. In 1840, they went to Michigan. And what was Michigan like in 1840? And did he marry? And did they have children? And why did he come to California in 1850? And what about the 1870 census? So those are the kinds of things that, let me see, I'm sorry to go back here. So those are some of the things just to think about when you're putting your story together. Okay, so maybe you do want to do a book. I think a book is actually a good way to go because your kids or your family's not necessarily going to throw out the book. And technology changes. And of course, we have the issues with our computers and updating and all this, and flash drives don't last forever. So a book is probably a good option, but it's only one option. So you self-publish a book and you may do it on just one person, one family. But maybe you just want to do a series of little stories, like 2 pages, like vignettes, maybe not just a whole book, and that's a possibility. Maybe you just want to do photos, transcriptions, a book generated by genealogy software. There is a publisher in Pacific Grove. Her name's Patricia Hamilton. Her publishing company is called Park Place Publications. I have visited her and spoken to her, and she does some beautiful work. She helps with the graphics, with the design, with the editing, and that's one way to go. And then there's some online publishing companies like Blurb. Create Space is the one with Amazon, and that's a good one. Lulu is another one. I've used Lulu. Shutterfly, I've used that. That's great for photos and text. There can be some text too. This is one of the books that Patricia Hamilton did. It's called A Boy's Story, and it was by one of the people that is in our Off the Charts group. Her name is Robin Ashelman, and she worked with Patricia Hamilton on this. And she started, I just love what she wrote. It's a beautiful book. She said, "It wasn't something I planned to do. It just sort of wrote itself. There we were at the camp table at the Lake of Memories, a summer outing for the last 42 years. My husband across from me, chin resting on his chest. No internet, no phone, no kids, June 2015. The drought heavy upon us, the lake low. Too old to walk way, way, way down to the diminished lake's edge. And oh dear, too hot to even try. We needed a break from doing nothing, a distraction from the heat. I don't know where the words came from. Tell me the story of walking on trees." And he did. iPad and keyboard in hand, my fingers whirled word and the story unfolded. And when it ended and the memory was fresh, I corrected the typos and filled in the blanks and asked him to tell me another story. And he did. So she had Patricia help her put this together, and she gave this as a gift to her family. These are some books of some other people that I know. Jeannie Gould and Barbara McCurran are 2 people that put books together of their stories. Jeannie's daughter is disabled, and this is the story of raising her and the things that she learned from that experience. I was in a writing group with her, and she would share the process of this book with us, and it was just amazing how she put this together. Barb was a kindergarten teacher for 45 years, and this is a story of her teaching and her many kids. It's a beautiful book. These were both done through Amazon and Create Space. The third book is a family history story. So I did my book called The Journey. It took me a couple years to do. It was a lot of work, but I gave it as a Christmas gift to my cousins. That's my brother and myself standing on the land of our great-grandfather's 160 acres in North Dakota. And these are my great-grandparents. This is the Långsbratten is a farm they left in Sweden. They came down from Gothenburg to Hull, took a train over to Liverpool, and then came to New York. And I was able to find pictures that documented their trip. This is the steamship, a steamship similar to the one they would have taken to come from Liverpool to New York. And here they would have been the New York they saw when they sailed into the harbor. Notice the Statue of Liberty is not there. And Ellis Island has not yet been built. They came into Castle Garden, which is that circular building on the center, on the lower part of Manhattan. And they came into a bustling, many languages, lines, trying to figure out where they were supposed to go. They only spoke Swedish. They had to figure out how they could get through the line and then get on a train to North Dakota. And then they came to North Dakota and built a sod house on their 160 acres. This was the town of Buxton, not a state, Indian Territory when they arrived. They moved to Kingsburg. And a tenant farmer who had to move from farm to farm in Sweden towards the end of his life was able to build this house in Kingsburg. It's pretty amazing. And that's my grandfather, the other man to the left. And he owned a Dodge. Really an amazing story. So I wanted to put that story together. And I used photos, which is not around anymore because I have a Mac, but I could still do this with these other companies. I placed my photos in the book, and my text was small. Largely photos is what I reflected on. And I had an editor help me because there were a lot of typos. Also, it's nice to have someone suggest how things might be rearranged too. So I did a dedication. I made sure there was a timeline so my cousins could see how it was all interconnected. And then I put the pages together using photos I had and photos that I found. The land, the deed, naturalization papers, the school classes of my grandfather and his siblings. Another house that my great-grandfather was able to build. This one burned down. And then finally, going to Sweden and meeting the relatives in Sweden. And the letters, seeing the letters that the Kingsburg family had sent to Sweden. And these Swedish ancestors had those letters, which was pretty amazing. And then I sent it to I sent it to some of my first cousins as a Christmas present. Well, I thought, I don't know if I can do that one again. That was an amazing accomplishment. And I was really proud of myself for doing that. But I decided maybe I should do this in a little easier format. And so I used the software on my genealogy software. And as I mentioned, I used Reunion. They have a book creation application within the software. And I used that, and that really worked well. We went off for our family reunion, and I made, in 2018, I made a book just using my notes and the photos. I went back in 2020, I spiffed it up a bit, added things, and added more pictures. And then I did a more professional book for another branch of the family, Australian family, that I had done with Lulu, and that was fairly easy to do. So that was easier rather than actually starting from scratch writing the text. I don't think it matters how you do it. It's just getting it out there. And remember, it's your voice. You don't have to worry about what you say, but the family that follows you will enjoy hearing your voice and your descriptions and how you say it. It doesn't have to be perfect by any means. And then maybe you just want to do short stories. I've been doing these short 2 pages, and some of my titles are Contested Will and Stolen Bible, When the Grave Sings, One Decision Changed 2 Lives. It's all started with 1 parakeet, 10 things my mother taught me. The red Volvo station wagon 240 DL. I don't know if any of you had those. I love that car. I love that car. And we all have DMV stories. So I just started writing these stories about my ancestors and about me. And I think one of my next books will be just to put these various 2-page stories together. Okay, we'll get to this again: the blog, the website, the scrapbook, the photo album, the interview, transcribe, the poem, the shadow box. Here's the blog. This is a cousin who did this. I thought this was great. She has been putting together a blog and putting all her people up. She's got my ancestor as well. She's told his story. And I sent her a picture that I had taken of the land because I thought she would be interested in adding that to her blog, and she did. Software can do a website too, if you want to put a website up. And what about a scrapbook or a photo album? This was a scrapbook that my father-in-law put together of his family, which has just been a gift to us. This is my husband's great-grandfather in the upper left there, and he fought in World War I. And then the merchant marine engineer on the bottom is his great-great-grandfather. And these pictures of World War I that were in the newspaper, thank goodness he put this together. Now, this is newspaper, which is acidic, so it's probably would behoove us to digitize this. But this is an amazing gift. As far as interviews, tape yourself. If you don't feel like writing, just tape yourself. There's a company called Storyworth, which will take your taping and put it into a story. And California Listens is another one. Storyworth sends you a question you may not have thought to write about. And it's a subscription. You write or record a story based on that question once a week, or however often you want to do it. And at the end of the year, Storyworth puts your stories together into a keepsake book. So that's one way to go if you are not necessarily, if you want to record your stories. California Listens, there's a group called Story Center in Berkeley that is taping stories, going to the libraries and taping stories and recording the stories of the people in their community. The Monterey Public Library has been involved in this as well. So that's another thing that's going on. Maybe you've got something that you want to transcribe. This is a book, a granddaughter of a friend of mine took the letters of her great-grandmother and transcribed them and put them in a book for her grandmother, which was a gift that she did. And then maybe there's a poem you want to write. There's something in you that wants to write about your ancestors. I wrote this based on George Ella Lyon, who was a Kentucky poet, and did this for a writing class. And I'm thinking I'm going to use this maybe at the beginning of my book of vignettes. I am from California, golden coastal hills, oak trees, fields of lupin and poppies. I am from cow pastures, poison oak, tadpoles, slow-moving creeks. I am from the Oakland Hills, Lafayette, Tahoe, Los Angeles, Carmel Valley, seasoned with New York City and Washington, D.C. So I went on and just talked a little bit about my background. And so maybe you're a poet and that's something that appeals to you. I did a shadow box of my grandmother and some of her, this was a slate she had in her schoolhouse. She was from Prunedale. And a quilt my mother made for me of all the dresses that I sewed when I was younger. It was very, I can remember these dresses and where I wore them. That was a real gift that my mother gave me. And then there's slideshows and movies. In a slideshow movie, just have a one-sentence title. Select a few photos that demonstrate who, what, when, just have them one right after the other. Create a one-sentence caption for each picture if you wish, but if you don't even have to do that. and keep it short because we don't want to keep it short. So you got everyone's attention. So I wanted to share with you one that my son did for his grandpa's 90th birthday. All he did was take pictures and put them one right after the other. And yet it captures my father's life. So that was just a really short little slideshow that we were able to show at my father's birthday, and he was thrilled. And now we've got it as a memory. This was one that I did after our first trip, our 2018 trip to Australia. And I did it to sort of thank the wonderful relatives down there and to put my husband's life in perspective. So this one I wanted to share with you as well.
I have fond memories of tow-headed cousins, hot valley summers, Swedish meatballs, my grandmother's warm apple pie, the sound of crickets, and great aunts and uncles sitting in lawn chairs, sharing stories in their mother tongue. I was raised in the midst of a large Swedish family. My cousins lived in small towns stretching from Turlock to Kingsburg. I lived in the suburbs of the East Bay and delighted in visiting my San Joaquin Valley family. My family immigrated to California 4 generations ago and put down roots. Bob does not have the same sense of family as I do. His family lives nearly 8,000 miles away in Australia and New Zealand. His ancestors made their way from Denmark to Scotland to New Zealand to Australia to America. He does not have the same sense of place, of 4 generations of family living in one country as I do. So apart from immediate family, he has been separated from his tribe. My family's story is one of finding its place in California. Bob's family story is one of separation, of moving on, always searching for a better life. So in February 2018, Bob and I, our 2 adult children, Bob's sister and our nephew, made a trip to Bob's homeland to attend a family reunion. This would be an opportunity to share with our children their dad's story and his roots. We visited the houses where my husband lived, the schools he attended. He entertained us with stories of his childhood, the magpie that attacked him one morning on his way to school, the frilled lizard who bit his toe when he was hiking barefoot in the bush, the time he ran home to share with his mother that he could now read. We connected with the descendants of his Danish great-grandfather and his New Zealand great-aunts and uncles. And so 50 cousins from Wellington, Perth, Adelaide, Sydney, Canberra, and Melbourne arrived to honor the Nielsen family and Bob's remaining uncle. 4 generations and 5 countries later, our California family connected with his family, the family that Bob had said goodbye to nearly 60 years ago. Yes, my husband is now truly an American citizen. He has lost his accent and has spent most of his life in America. But he is still an Australian, and we delighted in hearing that accent return. Part of my husband will always be Australian, and part will remain American. I think that that is the bittersweet situation for all immigrants. We were pleased to join him on this journey, and in the process, his family became our family. But maybe it was that way all along.
So I put that together to share with the Australian cousins and to thank them for the amazing time we had. So how do we do this? Well, I started with taking an online writing class that helped me get into it because I didn't see myself as a writer. And then I found a local writing class. And then I decided with a friend that maybe we needed to have our own support group, and we got together a genealogy writing group. So I took a class from Lisa Alzo. She's a genealogy writer. She's done a number of books, and that got me started. And she said, oh, you can do it, you can do it. And then I took a class with Aaliyah Thompson. Some of you may know her. She's a local poet. She teaches a memoirs class at the Carmel Foundation, and she's been doing that on Zoom this last year. And I learned so much from her. And she is one that says, just write 2 pages, write a vignette and put them together. Don't get overwhelmed. And we had an exhibit at the Monterey Public Library of all the things that we had put together. And then we had an exhibit at the Carmel Foundation. So that was really fun, and that got me excited about that. And then another librarian and I said, okay, we're going to put together our own support group that has got to do with genealogy and family history. And we created Off the Charts, and we've been meeting for 4 years now. We meet once a month, and we're all sharing our stories in different ways, not necessarily writing. Some are doing slideshows. We just had one of our members just did a wonderful movie of his family. But that's been really great. Off the Charts, we delight in the successes of each other. So share your project with others. Share it with your family. Share it with the Family History Center in Salt Lake. They take these stories. They will add them to the library. Share them with the Allen County Public Library, Fort Wayne, Indiana. That's the 2nd largest genealogy library in the country. In fact, I rode up in the elevator with Kurt Witcher, who is in charge of that library at a conference, Roots Tech in Salt Lake City. And I said, do you really take all of our notes and all of the things that we've been doing in the research? Do you really keep it? He said, absolutely. He said, people in the dead of night will drop off a box of their family things and leave it by the door of the library. And we try and make something of it. And it's there for people who are part of that family that might need it down the road. So that was amazing to me. The Daughters of the American Revolution takes family history stories. Local History Family Center will take family stories. An historical society will do it. I have given my book to the Kingsburg Historical Society. They were delighted to get it. I sent my book off to the Daughters of the American Revolution. They were very nice to take that. And I sent my book to the North Dakota State Library, and they said they were delighted to receive it. So these organizations want your work, and that's a way of passing it forward. And the local public library, we have people who donate things to the Monterey Public Library who are stories of their families, and we put it in the California History Room. So facts get recorded and stories get remembered. So what's your story? Just jump in and share those precious stories in whatever way you can. We can research forever, but we want that story to be shared with our families and with the world for that matter, and for those who will come after us. And while you're sharing those stories, you might just check out some of the things that are happening in the genealogy world. And I'll have this all in the notes. But these are places to go to learn more about genealogy. Conferences, I really recommend conferences. They are so great. Our local Monterey County Genealogy Society sponsors with the DAR chapter an ancestor roundup in January every year. And it's local, it's right there in Seaside. They have great speakers and it's a good place to start. Southern California Jamboree is great. That's in Burbank, and it's a little larger. It's probably 1,000 people or so. And that's a really wonderful conference to go to. Roots Tech is in Salt Lake City, and that's over the top. 30,000 people go. So you have to really feel brave to go to that one. But I have gone for a number of years, and I've learned a lot from that as well. I'm a big podcast listener. I like to do that on my walks and in the car. Not so much in the car these days, but certainly on my walks. And there are a number of podcasts that I listen to, and I'll put this in the notes. But Genealogy Gems is Lisa Louise Cook, and I really enjoy her. Genealogy Guys are two guys that are great. So these are ones that I listen to. And then maybe you're a webinar person, and two very good webinar series are Legacy Tree webinars, and the Southern California Genealogical Society has wonderful speakers. These both are subscription, but they are free when the speaker speaks initially, and then they're free for a week, and then they go into their archive. And at that point, you can have access if you have a subscription. But they are great webinars. There's YouTube programs. I, again, like Lisa Louise Cook, she has a Thursday program at 9. She calls it 11sies, and I've learned a lot from her. And then our local genealogy society, Monterey County Genealogy Society, meets in Seaside. It meets on the first Thursday of the month. We have been meeting on Zoom. And this organization has two groups. One is the DNA Special Interest Group. So if you're interested in exploring DNA, that's on the first Wednesday, also on Zoom right now. And then our group that I created with my library friend, Off the Charts Special Interest Group. And we meet on Wednesday, 1:30 to 3:30. And if you want more information on any of these, please just email me and I will be happy to answer any questions. And I'm here on Gmail. I've loved hearing from some of you. Some of you have sent questions or just stories, and I've loved that. And I'd love to stay in touch if any of you would like to do so. So please feel free to email me and I will get back to you. And I would love to hear some of your successes and frustrations, and whether or not you are indeed sharing your story with your family and with the world for that matter. So thank you. It's been a pleasure to be with you these last 4 weeks, and I hope I've given you some ideas and ways for you to continue on this journey.